'Twas the year 1995, and after years of conflict including the longest siege in modern warfare, as well as the only post-Holocaust genocide on European soil, the Bosnian War had ended with the Dayton Peace Agreement. And with peace came the foundations for moving forward. A system of governance so intent on making sure that war does not break out again, that while the governmental flowchart of Croatia looks like this, the one for Bosnia looks like that. And this is not because they hired some sort of poli-sci intern to build the foundations of a nation. No, instead it is a deliberate web of concessions and compromises to make sure that everybody stops shooting. A side effect of this has been that, for years now, youth, both international and Bosnian alike, have struggled to understand what the system really is. In fact, even the researcher who put together this flowchart spent 3 times as many pages trying to explain the Bosnian government compared to other Balkan governments. And despite that, he still made a few mistakes. And with the general federal elections coming this fall, I too was out to find out as much information as I could about exactly how and who I am voting for. And this has led ultimately to the creation of this video, because I did not manage to find any satisfactory content out there. I have now decided to create my own in hopes of making this year's voting just a little bit easier for everyone. To begin, especially for my international audience, some background information. If you are Bosnian or simply don't care, there are timestamps in the video so you can just skip to whatever part you like. Hi, I'm Jan and I'm from Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. When it comes to understanding this place, you'll have to get used to a few things. Firstly, always think in 3. This may seem like some sort of uniform blob of land in Europe, but in practice there are 3 key factions that we here call the constituent peoples: the Bosniaks, the Croats, and the Serbs. All of which are ethnic identities not to be confused with nationalities like Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian. The reason for this distinction is that there are around 3.3 million citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but there are only around 1.7 million Bosniaks, 540,000 Croats, and a million Serbs. There also exists the often controversial category of other, which I will get into later. So, one of the main themes you will see in this video is just how much we like to separate territory. Let's go from the biggest divisions down to the smallest. There are 2 main entities that form this country: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska. As the name of the latter implies, it is a territory that is supposed to generally be inhabited by a majority Serb population, while the former is comprised of both majority Bosniak and majority Croat areas. Exceptions to this rule of course exist, as drawing the lines to encompass an ever-changing demographic landscape is, to put it mildly, kind of difficult. There also exists the district Brčko, a condominium between the 2 entities. The best comparison to this whole system would probably be like the American states. Like, you could imagine that the Federation is Virginia and then the Republic is Maryland, and the district is something like DC that is owned by everybody and nobody at the same time. The point generally being that these are 2 distinct entities that act largely independently from each other, but do not have borders like countries would. We can further divide these entities into smaller areas. The Federation is composed of 10 cantons, usually ordered Unsko-Sanski, Posavski, Tuzlanski, Zemsko-Dobojski, Bosansko-Podrinski, Srednjo-Bosanski, Hercegovačko-Neretvanski, Zapadno-Hercegovački, Canton Sarajevo, and finally, the creatively named Canton number 10. These within the Federation act almost identical to US states, where they all have their own ministries and institutions, with exceptions to some government functions only really being reserved for the federal government, like defense and foreign affairs. The point of this system, at least according to Dayton, is to ensure that neither the Bosniaks or the Croats can dominate each other. Can dominate the other within the Federation. These cantons are then further broken down into municipalities for even more local things like public utilities and urban planning. You might assume that Republika Srpska has the same, and you would assume wrong. Since they are officially a republic, their government is a lot more centralized. For example, they are technically divided into regions, but depending on the institution, the number of regions and their shapes may vary wildly. And for all intents and purposes, the regions have no political power and are simply organizational. Instead, Republika Srpska generally acts directly from the entity level onto the municipal level. Finally, the district kind of acts as its own independent canton because it has its own ministries and municipalities like the cantons with some extra privileges otherwise reserved for the entities. So when it comes to political positions, I will once again be moving from top to bottom, and I will focus more on the positions that are voted for. So what I'm about to say may actually confuse a lot of foreigners, but all the Bosnians in the crowd will start rolling their eyes immediately. We have not one, not two, but 3 presidents. Or as most of the literature refers to it, members of the presidency. They each represent one of the 3 constituent peoples that make up Bosnia and Herzegovina. It means that each of them has to identify as either a Bosniak, Croat, and a Serb, and there can only be one of each. Now the voting part is actually where it gets a little complex. Let's start simple. All those who live in Republika Srpska vote for the Serb member, whether they identify themselves as Bosniak, Croat, or Serb. The other 2 are chosen by voters from the Federation, with each voter only being able to vote for one of the 2 members. Anyone can choose to vote for either candidate, meaning that you do not have to identify yourself as Croat to vote for the Croat candidates or Bosniak to vote for the Bosniak candidates. One may already see why this could be problematic. It technically means that if all the Bosniak voters organize themselves and spread themselves out correctly, they could influence both the Croat member and the Bosniak member. And this is not really merely theoretical. In fact, it's already kind of happened with Željko Komšić, who is generally much more popular among Bosniak voters than Croat voters, but is the current Croat representative. And this is why you might have heard in a lot of news that some Balkan politicians want a 3rd Croat entity to be created. But that is generally beyond the scope of this part of the video. Speaking of a 3rd entity, what about the district? Well, those in the district can actually choose whichever person they want to vote for. However, this is determined by whether or not an individual registers themselves as a resident of the Federation or as a resident of the Republic, meaning that they are locked into the rules of one of the entities rather than deciding which of the 3 they are voting for on voting day. All citizens in Bosnia also vote for the Federal Parliamentary Assembly, this time choosing parties rather than specific individuals. So whereas the presidency works something like the presidential party primaries in the US, the Parliamentary Assembly is much more similar to European parliamentary systems. Once again, the residents of the 2 entities vote separately, each from a different party list that will fill the entire Parliamentary Assembly. This time, the voters of the Federation, however, are not limited by ethnicity, meaning that everybody votes for any party. However, the Parliamentary Assembly still does have to meet a certain quota of Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. Therefore, after the votes are counted, the Central Election Commission, Centralna izborna komisija, assigns the seats by both quota and by popular vote. This means that even if most Croats woke up on voting day and decided to vote only for Bosniak parties, this would be underrepresented in the Parliamentary Assembly, while the Croat parties they did not vote for would be overrepresented. The Republika Srpska is not safe from this either, as they too have their own quotas for Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats, meaning that if by some miracle all the Serbs voted for something like nationalistic Croat parties, the majority of their parliament share would still be filled with Serbs. As you can see, this can get very, very complicated, but the main thing to know is that you as a voter have no say in these quotas, meaning that your vote, depending on who exactly you're voting for and where exactly do you live, may count more or less than somebody else's. And the international audience may think like, whoa, how is this considered a democracy? But actually, something like the Swiss system has this too, and so does the US. I recommend watching this video on the Swiss elections. However, in order to make sure that the individual that may be the reason you voted for a specific party does get into power, you are allowed to highlight him or her specifically on the ballot in order for them to have a higher chance of being elected. Interesting fact, one of the first 2 people that you can highlight for every party on every ballot must be a woman, meaning that every party has to have at least semi-strong female representation, although most of the times this does just mean that the second person's a woman. Back to the Parliamentary Assembly. which itself is made up of the House of Representatives and the House of Peoples. The latter is made out of 15 individuals, 5 of every ethnicity, and the former is made up of 28 delegates from the Federation and 14 from the Republic. The people you vote for by highlighting them are actually most likely to get into these two positions, meaning that all the people in the Parliamentary Assembly in practice are approved both by the public and the party they are part of. The rest of the politicians in these parties go to the entity governments, which are led by the National Assembly of Republika Srpska and the Parliament of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is it sounding like Star Wars yet? Anyways, both of these are separate from the Federal Assembly, with citizens of both entities having to vote on a separate ballot for their representatives. This means that if you want to vote for one party for the Federal Assembly and another one for your entity government, you can. The Parliament of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina complicates this even further, as they have their own House of Peoples and House of Representatives, while the National Assembly of Republika Srpska does not, and yada yada yada. The important thing for you to know is that when you vote for your entity governments, you once again vote for parties with specific individuals you can highlight as your preference, and it is these people who are going to be passing all of your laws within the entities. Foreign viewers might be asking themselves, why does it take a ballpark of 200 plus different politicians in order to run a country on a federal level that only has 3.3 million people? That is a very good question. Yeah. In fact, the sort of running joke in the country is that all the Croats in Bosnia work for the government, because they're only like 15% of the population, but in general they are considered 33% of the government. So especially in places like Sarajevo that don't have that high of a Croat population, the only time you ever really hear of them is if they're in some sort of government position. From here we move on to the ministers, which are not directly voted for. Instead, both entities have their own way of picking ministers, because of course they had to be different. For the Federation, the Parliament first picks a president and then 2 vice presidents, all of whom typically belong to the 3 major peoples. The president then nominates a prime minister, whom the vice presidents must approve, before the prime minister can then go off and select all the different ministers. Except, oops, not really, they can only select the federal level ones, and the rest are picked individually by the different cantons, which we will get into in a bit. Republika Srpska is a little different, as they also have to vote directly for the president of Republika Srpska, who then appoints whichever prime minister he deems fit, and it is this prime minister that selects a group of ministers which require National Assembly approval before they can be instated. Finally, the people of the district once again get to identify with one entity or the other and vote in their entity elections. But they also have a federal assembly of their own, which picks a mayor, who picks ministers and such. There is one more ballot which is entity-specific. Those of the Federation vote for their cantonal governments, while those of the Republic vote for the aforementioned President of the Republic. The Republic ballot for the President is actually similar to that of the Presidency, where you vote for person over party, while the one in the Federation for the cantonal governments is more similar to that of the Federal Assembly, whereby you can vote for parties and highlight individuals to create cantonal assemblies. And that is it for the federal elections this year. To summarize, we are voting for the federal presidency, the federal assembly, the entity governments, and then the cantonal governments or the republic president, depending on where you live. So if you're from the Federation, these are your ballots, and if you're from the Republic, these are your ballots. Not that complex, huh? What about the district? Fuck. Now, as I've already pointed out in this video, there are a few main issues that come with the system. The biggest of which, in my opinion, comes from the term other. I spent a lot of this video talking about the 3 constituent peoples, but around 5% of the country does not identify with any of these labels at all. I personally don't identify myself as Bosniak, Croat, and Serb, and instead see myself as a Bosnian and Herzegovinian. And when the next census comes, if it comes, that will be exactly what I declare myself as. This is mostly because I'm an atheist with Yugoslav tendencies who believes that all these differences between our peoples are equivalent to being like Texan or a New Yorker. And while I do agree that differences exist, this should not be the determining factor in every step of governance of a country. Especially when this entails that people like me cannot do things like run for president or be in the House of Peoples. which at the end of the day are the most influential positions. And I completely understand that 5% of the population should not dictate the life within the country, but then again, neither should 15%, which is just how many Croats there are. And nothing against the Croats, I want them to be in government as much as anybody else, but it seems to me hypocritical to defend the system with this very common kind of number ratio argument. Say the Cefinci, two lawyers who are Roma and Jewish respectively, meaning that they are considered other in the country, appealed to the European Court of Human Rights to find the solution, or at least pressure for one, in 2009. Yet since then very little has changed. And in fact, most of their argument doesn't actually have anything to do with the category of other, rather they argue that the system, because of all the quotas, leads to local misrepresentation. But anyway, I might get into that in another video. The next and probably more timely issue is that of Željko Komšić, who, despite being the Croat representative currently, has been greatly helped by his popularity among Bosniak voters. This has led to him winning 4 separate elections for the presidency, despite the fact that a majority of Croats vote for other people. And then this further led to Zoran Milanovic, the current president of Croatia, to attempt to veto the entrance of Sweden and Finland into NATO until Bosnia creates a new entity so that the Croats can more fairly vote for their own representatives. Not only is this an absurd threat, but obviously it never materialized, but also he's an SDP, and if he let all the Croats here vote, they'd all probably vote for his direct opposition in the form of HDZ. So why even do this? And finally, there's the problem of Milorad Dodik, or more accurately, the position of the president of Republika Srpska. To make a very long and controversial story short, the republic, by virtue of being a republic, has always been more centralized than the federation. So while the federation has a cantonal system that makes it practically impossible for the Croat Herceg Bosna to declare itself independent from everyone, the republic does not have any safeguards. Instead, every few years, every time elections come about, nationalist leaders in the republic threaten secession. Something that the republic cannot do according to Dayton, and something that is also just common sense. And this strategy has actually worked perfectly because Milorad Dodik and his party SNSD have been in power since 2006 uninterrupted. I think they've been in power since I was born. Shit. In any case, because they have had so much power, this led to an election that may or may not have been rigged, and honestly, if I go into it, there will be a 3.5-hour video essay about Hungarian special forces coming. So there you have it, a kind of look at the upcoming elections and what exactly us Bosnians have to deal with every 4 years. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe and share or whatever you guys do. I don't know, I'm pretty new to this. If you have any other video ideas, I guess, put them in the comments. I was thinking maybe I could make a video on the local governments or going over this year's candidates, maybe going over their campaigns, I don't know. With that being said, bye.